Well, the government this week announced plans to allow non-citizens to join the Australian Defence Force. It was a slightly clumsy announcement with some confusion over which foreigners would be eligible. But when you step back and consider what this is about, it's another example of Australia trying to improve its military readiness, in this case by boosting recruitment. It's also, of course, embarked on an ambitious and expensive plan to acquire nuclear submarines, as well as, of course, more surface ships and missiles. Is it clear what threat, though, Australia actually faces and what would happen in the event of war? How exactly would the alliance with the US, for example, come into play? We're going to try to tackle these big questions with a couple of excellent guests with slightly different views today. I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, Mike Pezzullo is a former Deputy Secretary of Defence and lead author of the 2009 Defence White Paper. He was Secretary of the Home Affairs Department as well until last year, when he left after an investigation found he'd breached the Public Service Code of Conduct. He did deal with those issues at great length with Sarah Ferguson on 7:30 a little while ago. We'll put the link to that interview in the show notes. Today, though, we're going to focus on defence matters, although I might slip in a question on immigration a little later on. Sam Roggeveen was a senior intelligence analyst with the Office of National Affairs and is now the director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program. His recent book, The Echidna Strategy, caused something of a stir in defence and strategic circles recently, challenging much of the consensus by suggesting that the threat posed to Australia by China is overstated, and the case for spending more on defence is, well, it exaggerates the danger posed to our territory. So two somewhat different views on the strategic outlook and what Australia should be doing about it. Sam, Mike, welcome to both of you.
Thank you, David. Hi, Sam.
I guess the good place to start here is the question of what China's ambitions and intentions are in the region and what threat that therefore poses to Australia and its interests. You do have somewhat different views on this. Mike, first to you, what threat does China pose?
I think without reducing it too directly to the idea of threat, and just taking a slight step back, but not too far back, in terms of China's strategic interests, it seems to me that for many decades, for all sorts of reasons to do with their development status, where they were in terms of their own growth path and the rest of it, but also the lessons that they took out of the fall of the Soviet Union and the predominance of American power that became very evident after the fall of the Soviet Union. I think for many decades, the Chinese interest was to hide strength and bide time. It was a phrase that was resonant right throughout the Chinese system. It's not to say that in the longer term China didn't see itself rejuvenating, re-establishing itself in what in its mind is a world historical preeminence in the world, but for many decades they were cautious, very restrained. Now, we could spend a whole program on what happened, what the tipping point was, but we're not going to do that, I suspect, because we want to go on to the policy response. It seems to me in about the late 2000s, they made a very deliberate decision to start accelerating their military capability very significantly. Now, that doesn't presage an intent to use it, but it certainly indicates a desire to have the capability. It's taken them about 20 years to develop a very formidable military capability. Where are they now? I don't think that they're a threatening presence at the moment at all, except in some limited areas, such as I wouldn't want to be a Filipino Marine sitting on the Sierra Madre on the Second Thomas Shoal. I wouldn't want to have a high-powered water cannon blasted in my face across the deck of my ship. And I certainly wouldn't want to be crew involved in an unsafe and unprofessional incident at sea. But typically at the moment, they're still keeping tensions below the simmering point.
You have said, though, that if China continues on its present course, the likelihood of a major war occurring before 2030 in the Pacific area is at least 10%, if not higher.
Yes.
How do you arrive at that?
So at the moment, I think they're still simmering. They are increasing pressure, whether it's in relation to Taiwan, whether it's in relation to their claims in the East China Sea, whether it's in relation to their claims against the western parts of the Philippines. They're not ready. CIA Director Burns has talked about intelligence. He's used the word intelligence, which is a very unusual term for an intelligence head to say, that based on intelligence, their assessment is that she has given directions to the military to be ready, not to go, but to be ready to go in 2027. So we've got about 3 years if you take that intelligence, or that assessment at least of the intelligence
that's in
those
relation to
terms.
Taiwan.
In relation to Taiwan. However, David, an assault on Taiwan or a blockade on Taiwan shouldn't be seen as some standalone event and as if shipping and life would continue, air travel would continue.
That inevitably involves us.
It would spill into many other adjacent theatres. There's no question about that. Quickly to finish off on that point, I think at the moment wise heads are planning to prevail. That's why at the moment I'm only willing to rate the risk, the likelihood, at about 10%, but it is growing. So on any given day between now and the end of the decade, on any given 10 days, there's one day that I'm fearful, so 1 in 10, that miscalculation will occur. But
nine of those days you're okay. Sam,
indeed.
How would you characterise then China's ambitions and intentions in the region?
Well, I don't quarrel with much of that, but what I'd perhaps do just to change the framing a little bit is to take China specifically out of it and just look at a great power and how a great power behaves in the world. China now, by any measure, is the second largest economy in the world, and by some measures is already the largest. No country of that stature will indefinitely be content to be a subordinate strategic power in its own region.
History tells us that.
I think history tells us that. I mean, there are some exceptions like post-World War II Germany, West Germany, and post-World War II Japan, which were content to be economic giants but remain strategic clients, effectively, of the United States. China's obviously not in that category. We know that already. So I think China is going to, like any great power, is going to behave in such a way that it will develop a sphere of influence in its own region and become the predominant power in its own region, if not the dominant power.
Yeah, this is the key. And that means the US no longer being that.
That means pushing the US out, yeah. So effectively what we've got here is a clash of wills and a clash of resolve. Which side wants this more? Now, Mike's formulation in the article I think you referred to earlier is that the United States has primacy in East Asia and wants to maintain it, and the job of Australia is to support the United States in that ambition. That is, I think, the point of difference between us. First of all, in some ways, my diagnosis of the problem is slightly darker than Mike's, because I don't think the United States does aim to maintain primacy in the region. I mean, in some ways, it's already lost it, but actually I doubt that the United States has the resolve to either retain or regain primacy in the Asia-Pacific region, and therefore we have to do much of this heavy lifting by ourselves and not assume that the Americans will be there for us.
Just on that point, you write in your book about this, that since the end of the Cold War, what's happened to the US military presence in the region?
Well, in a word, nothing. I'm slightly over dramatising there, but what I mean to say is that if you go back and look at the standard guide on this is the International Institute of Strategic Studies put out a book every year called The Strategic Balance. If you go back and look at the strategic balance for 1991 and compare it to the one for 2023, the American presence in Asia looks roughly the same. So roughly the same number of troops,
no growth,
the same number of ships, same carriers. Not much has changed. One thing that has changed reasonably dramatically is where its forces are distributed. So the Philippines has come into play more over the last few years. They've got agreement now to put new bases in the Philippines, and Australia is going to become a military base for the United States.
I want to come to that, but what you're suggesting here is this isn't so much just a Trump issue, whether we should be worried about whether Trump might want to withdraw from the region. You're saying, Sam, that the US has been on this trajectory, not withdrawing, but just not expanding its presence.
Right, standing pat. Yeah, so I would argue Trump is not a revolutionary, he's an accelerant. All the trends that I've seen over the last 30 years might very well accelerate under Trump, but the direction of movement won't change no matter who's in power. So I think ultimately America lacks the resolve. Some resources are going to be a big issue too, because China's just so big. And don't forget, just on this question of scale, the United States has never taken on an adversary or a group of adversaries that have more than 60% of US GDP. Now, China passed that mark back in 2014. So already it is by far the largest adversary America's ever taken on. If you want to take on a contest of that kind, you need an extremely good reason. You need an existential reason. And despite China's size, I don't think the stakes for the US are existential. So ultimately the job is too big and the stakes are too small for the US. And again, therefore, allies like Australia will have to do more for themselves.
Well, let's talk about that. What Australia does need to do for itself. We know about AUKUS. We know that involves a big spend and a very ambitious plan for nuclear submarines and everything else, but primarily nuclear submarines. Mike, you obviously think that's a good idea.
I do. Can I just very, very quickly just bounce back on a couple of points? One, I completely agree that great powers do things that other powers don't. However, they do it very differently. If you look at very quick historical example, Imperial Germany, whilst Bismarck was there, was very restrained, very moderated. They were getting strategic space. The moment Bismarck goes, Wilhelm II kicks him out of office as Chancellor. They become aggressive. They start pushing against the British Empire. What happens 20 years later? A world war. There are choices that great powers make. Really important. We can't just simply be deterministic and say power increases, certain things follow. Secondly, and relatedly, I'm not sure that I agree fully. There are some elements of Sam's analysis of the US position that I agree with and some that I don't. So let's not get too caught up because otherwise we won't get onto Australia. However, one of the reasons why American presence has been largely stable, and I agree if you count the troops, aircraft carriers, fighter wings, is largely their defence to GDP has not changed much. What has happened, though, is that there's been a very significant increase in armament, in military capacity in Japan, Australia to some extent, and others. Now, the Americans have got more fronts they've got to cover because they've also got to swing troops into the Euro-Atlantic area. But I wouldn't write off American will and resolve, and we can talk about that if you want to.
So AUKUS then, without getting too much into the prosecuting the arguments for and against particular submarines and so on.
Yes.
But this you obviously think is the right thing for Australia to do.
I think in terms of Pillar 1, the underwater capability, absolutely, and indeed in the 2009 white paper to which you made reference, the next phase was going to be a large conventional boat, 12 of, either in evolved Collins or in some competitive evaluation.
And that never happened.
It never happened. It was put on the shelf, and we can talk about that on this or another program at some time.
We might park that one, but yeah.
But that was going to be a stepping stone to either an even larger still conventional boat, or probably by that stage a nuclear boat. And that's just simply a function of the fact that the underwater space is now much more contested. You need more capability on board, including the ability to deploy off-board certain capabilities that are in development.
And Sam, what's your view then on this AUKUS plan?
Well, David, I think Australia's single biggest defence asset is distance. Beijing's closer to Berlin than it is to Sydney, and that's routinely forgotten in the Australian defence debate. And at the heart of the AUKUS submarine project is an effort to actually compress that distance effectively. The whole reason you buy nuclear-powered submarines is because they have long range, high speed and high endurance. Yes. That means you can get to faraway battlefields very quickly.
Like Taiwan.
Like Taiwan, and you can stay there for months on end. So effectively what Australia's trying to do is compress the distance between us and China. We're building a fleet that can operate off the Chinese coast.
But hasn't China already done that?
Yes, sure, but I don't see much reason for Australia to reciprocate. I mean, great powers, as Mike rightly says, will behave as they do. But, middle powers don't have to reciprocate. In fact, I would argue that when a middle power comes into any kind of security clash with a great power, when they escalate, they lose, right? So it's very much in Australia's interest to not escalate.
Together, or they band.
Sure, that's right. But you need to find reliable partners to band together with.
Of course. Brings us back to the United States.
Yeah, so exactly, which brings us back to the United States. And that's the other danger, I think, in AUKUS, is that it does tie us much more closely to American strategic ambitions and to American foreign policy goals in the region. Now, when there's a whole debate regarding AUKUS around the term sovereignty. And you'll hear Miles, the defence minister, say routinely, well, these are going to be Australian submarines, they're going to be Australian flagged, Australian crewed, we will be in charge. And of course he's right, there's no question about that. Australia ultimately will be in charge of these submarines. But when you partner with the United States in the most intimate technological and strategic partnership of any two countries in the modern era, then you can and build submarines that are specifically designed for an operation to work alongside the United States in an operation in North Asia, then on the day the balloon goes up, you can't suddenly say, well, sorry, America, we're not in. So just having these capabilities creates expectations on the US side.
Is that the reality? Just on that point, Mike? That
I wouldn't disagree with elements of what Sam said, although other elements I would. In terms of, I'll just quickly go to the obligation question. We've already got a security treaty with the United States. It was signed in 1951. People typically stop at the article that says we will consult in the case of a crisis or a threat. Article 4 is very clear. It's very close, not quite the NATO formulation in Article 5 of NATO, but basically it says if you attack the other country, metropolitan territory, armed forces, it's considered to be a threat to your own safety and security, and you will act. That's what Article 4 says. So we've already got a treaty expectation. That's why you go into treaties, in order to provide a future promise of mutual assistance. Now, it doesn't specify exactly what kind of action we will take. No, of course it doesn't.
So this is partly what you've written about in your piece for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute this week.
Yes.
What does the treaty mean when it comes to an American asset or an Australian asset being hit by China in the region? What does it mean if critical infrastructure here is attacked?
I think it's very clear, David, and this requires a bit of exegesis of the treaty and what the words mean. And you can parse words down, or you can amplify them. But on the plain reading, it says, and leaving New Zealand to one side, because of course New Zealand was an initial signatory, but in 1986 its security assurances from the United States were suspended because of the attitude that it took towards nuclear-powered or nuclear-armed vessels and aircraft. So putting New Zealand to one side, it's effectively a bilateral treaty. It says if the other side is attacked, so either if the United States is attacked from Australia's point of view or vice versa, in its metropolitan territory, and recalling in 9/11, we included the definition of metropolitan US to be the city of New York City, because Australia in the Parliament stood up and said, through the Prime Minister and supported by the then opposition, ANZUS is invoked. So that one historical case takes us all the way to the east coast of America. But the treaty also talks about the armed forces of that country in the Pacific area. Now, on my simple reading of the text, the Pacific area surely has to include Japan, it has to include US forces in Korea, it has to include perhaps US forces defending Taiwan, for instance.
So an attack on US forces defending Taiwan would invoke the ANZUS Treaty?
My reading is, yes. Now, invoke is one thing, because Article 4 then says you will act to meet the common danger.
What does that mean?
Well, it's never been... It's a treaty is a contract, but there's no terms and conditions attached to it. It's literally the words of the treaty.
And does that need to be spelled out so we know what happens in the event of something like this?
The way in which it's spelt out typically, so the security treaty that the Americans have with Korea or the Americans have with Japan, or the multilateral security agreement that is NATO, is buttressed by a whole lot of political and military structures that sit underneath the treaty, planning groups, meetings of military chiefs, the planners who think about the use of particular types of weapons, including nuclear weapons, and they say, subject to a final political clearance on the day, because it's always subject to a political decision of a sovereign government. Here's how, for instance, say, take the Cold War, NATO was preparing to absorb a Soviet attack, for instance. All of that planning is done. They exercise on the ground. They figure out whether they would defend in eastern Germany, or they'd fall back to the Rhine.
And you reckon all this needs to be laid out in some sort of war plan?
Yes,
now?
Absolutely.
You've even argued we need a joint command.
Yes.
Is this... Well, firstly, I ask you...
Well, sorry, I argue that because that's what a military alliance requires. If it doesn't have it...
But is it a little provocative to lay all that out at the moment?
But any treaty is a signal to someone else that we are banded together. If you attack one of us, you're attacking all of us, and we're prepared in that eventuality to strike you back or to deal with you.
Because some of it is pretty grey at the moment, isn't it, Sam? About, we have US forces in the Northern Territory, but what would happen to them in the event of conflict? Maybe it's deliberately vague, I don't know. But what are the merits in doing what Mike's suggesting?
No, I'm sure it is deliberately vague, and I get the feeling our politicians would run a mile from being much more specific about it, because not just internationally but domestically, I think it would be
alarming.
I think it would cause a lot of trouble for them that they'd prefer to avoid. I'd also just offer a slight caution on the value of treaties generally. I mean, ultimately, and I know Mike acknowledges this in his article too, and I think he did just now, that ultimately governments and nations make decisions on the basis of their core national interests, no matter what
on the day,
no matter what the treaty says.
I accept that. Yeah.
And of course, remember, I think it was 2017, there was a crisis in NATO because Trump There was a rumour got out that Trump was refusing to, in an upcoming speech, endorse Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and that's the active part of the treaty.
We've got your back part.
Yeah, that's the Three Musketeers part. One for all and all for one.
An attack on one is an attack on all. Yeah.
So, and Trump apparently was refusing to endorse it in his speech, and eventually he came around and he was planning, and he did eventually endorse it. But ask yourself why that mattered, right? The treaty's there in black and white. It's already written. The Americans have signed it. Everyone has signed it. Why does it matter if a particular politician refuses to endorse it? Well, it's because the treaty's
it's only worth so much.
Worth as much as the backing that the politicians give it on any given day.
I accept that.
Well, let's come back to the US then, and how reliable it is as a partner. Obviously, all eyes are on Donald Trump, and yes, there's unpredictability, uncertainty about what that might mean if he's back in the White House. Sam, bottom line, would the US, whether it's Trump or someone else, come to Australia's aid?
Well, first of all, it's very difficult to imagine circumstances at the moment in which Australia would be attacked outside of a more general breakdown in the security circumstances in the region.
I agree.
So it is much easier to imagine Australia being attacked in the context of a war over Taiwan, for instance. So we've got the joint facilities here. In future, we're going to have American bombers based out of Northern Australia. We're going to have American nuclear-powered submarines based out of HMAS
and we have
Sterling.
Pine Gap, of course, other facilities.
Right. Although those might be exempt from Chinese targeting because they're so sensitive to the nuclear balance between the two countries. So they might get left alone.
Right.
Very difficult to imagine circumstances in which they would Australia would be attacked outside of a more general war. But I would offer just a broader caution based on what we've seen in Ukraine over the last few years. It's of course notable how much the United States has done, more than anyone expected. The scale and the type of arms deliveries, unprecedented levels of economic sanctions on Russia, even if we can now say that they're probably not working in the way intended, but the scale of them really is unprecedented. Intelligence support, diplomatic support, all very laudable. However, the missing piece, no direct American or NATO military involvement in the conflict. Now, what is the lesson that Asia's American allies should take, and in particular Taiwan? Here is a nuclear-armed great power attacking a near neighbour, and the US doesn't commit troops to defend that smaller neighbour. I think the lesson that the Taiwanese should be taking, and the lesson the rest of us should be learning as well, is that slowly but surely America's alliance network in Asia is going to be Ukrainified. You will get lots of help. You will get arms. You will get intelligence. You will get diplomatic and economic support. Will you get troops? I'm not so sure anymore.
That means no commitment to maintaining their primacy in the region.
Ultimately, I think, yes, that's what's at stake.
And Mike, do you agree or disagree with that?
I think that there are some of those traits and tendencies that Sam's accurately laid out that would give rise to that perception, with a couple of caveats though. One, the difference being that Ukraine was not under American protection through some kind of security assurance. In the case of Taiwan, you've got the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 that actually it requires the executive to arm, support and defend Taiwan as circumstances require. Now, the definition of those terms might vary from time to time. Do you put trainers on the ground? Do you provide them with munitions? Do you break a blockade? Do you actually put ground troops on the ground to augment their...
It's a spectrum.
It's a spectrum, and it goes back to this point that Sam very well made earlier, that any president's going to make that decision based on their calculation of the national interest on the day. But Taiwan and Ukraine are actually quite different cases from that point of view.
They are. But do you think the US has the stomach to defend Taiwan?
Yes, I think they do, and that includes under President Trump for this reason alone. And Mr. Trump... I agree with Sam, in a sense, is an accelerant of certain tendencies rather than a revolutionary breaker of them. He will want to double down, in my view, and we saw this actually in the first term, because he understands that trade follows the flag. If the American flag gets pushed out of Asia, if the American flag gets pushed out of the Pacific, he actually knows that that's devastating for America's economy, because then you do start to get, effectively, you start to get dual prosperity spheres, an American-centred one over in the Americas with maybe a bit of trade into Europe, and in China dominating the Eurasian sphere.
A war with China would also be rather devastating for their economy.
And so that's why I think both sides will, on the day, at least 9 days out of 10, figure out a way, like Cuba in October '62, when things are getting really hot,
to avoid it,
and ships are in the water and submarines are under the sea, and someone's got their finger on the torpedo ready to fire. Someone will say to Jack Kennedy, "Mr. President, I don't think this is a good idea." So that's the reason why I'm still at about 10% or thereabouts is because I think that crisis instinct will cut in at that point.
Just on the question of America having the stomach for this, I myself am always at pains to say that I don't make any moral judgments about the United States, about its character or its courage. I'm merely making prudential judgments about its interests. And I don't think America's interests are tied in enough to demand the kind of sacrifices that a war against China would actually demand, and including actually the economic ones. I mean, the European nations ceased to be strategic powers in Asia right after the Second World War, and yet their economic interests in Asia have exploded in the period since. So it's not impossible to imagine America as I think a much more normal great power, which has a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere and is still the largest or the second largest economy in the world, but doesn't have a global security interest in the way that it currently does.
This is a fascinating conversation, and I feel like I could keep going for hours, but it would be remiss not to ask you just something topical this week. As I mentioned earlier, the question of whether Australia needs to recruit non-citizens, at least from the Five Eyes partner countries, New Zealand, Canada, the US and the UK. Mike, good idea?
Look, it's good policy. Probably should have happened a while ago. There's such deep connections with the Five Eyes. We reciprocate each other's clearances. We understand each other's systems. So I think that that's good policy from that point of view. I'd be sceptical and indeed concerned about expanding it much beyond the Five Eyes, if at all. But you're really only tinkering at the edges, because the personnel shortfall, it's a big problem, isn't it? And I think ASPI in their latest budget analysis has got a dedicated chapter on this. The shortfall is the problem. So very quickly, what do you do about that? I think, and I've served a very long time ago in the reserve, so I've got no sense of what it is to serve in a full-time capacity. But it just seems to me the model is geared to a very, and I know the defence hierarchy is seized of this, so I'm not telling them anything they probably don't know, but I think the model is based on a very mid-20th century model where there was perhaps one breadwinner, typically on a gendered basis with the female partner at home, and so they would then follow this is a full-time military.
They're trying to address that now.
I think they are, but the idea now that you've got typically a breadwinner in the military and you've got mum staying at home, there's a whole lot of issues there to be unpacked about gender roles and the rest of it. It's a very old model. How you now cope with one member being in the military, the other member having a high-powered professional job somewhere else, not easily being able to move around, I think that's a vexed problem. Having barracks and accommodation close to bases which tend to be on the fringes of cities, a long way out from services, is also an issue. And then look, finally, even if you address all of that, quantum's going to matter, and Sam and I will disagree about this, or perhaps we might agree, because this perhaps lines up with his Echidna strategy more so than anything else we've said. We're going to need a bigger base, perhaps more in the reserves, that you can quickly mobilise. So a lot of military jobs these days are so dual use. Analytics, computer science, cyber, etc. You could probably have actually, as some countries do, a lot of your military actually working in the general economy.
It's an interesting point, Sam, because a lot of the modern military roles aren't what they once were, right? So we could be drawing a lot more private expertise.
Sure, and the Echidna strategy is actually not that labour intensive. I mean, I'm basically arguing for an Australian Defence Force that is focused on protecting the air and maritime approaches to Australia's north, and if you wanted to simplify that, the ability to sink ships and to shoot down aircraft if they're coming at us. That's not a particularly labour intensive task. It requires a lot of technology and a lot of really highly educated and therefore highly paid people, but not a huge amount of them. So part of the problem here, and I agree with Mike, we're fiddling around the edges a bit, but part of the problem actually is that I think we're looking to expand the army, and I'm not sure that's all that relevant to a strategy focused on China.
That might be an argument we can continue post podcast. Look, I did threaten to squeeze in one on immigration, and I will. Direction 99 has been dominating politics over the last week or two. Government's hastily rewriting it. A bunch of convicted criminals that were allowed to stay in Australia despite having their visa cancelled. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal used this direction from the Minister, the Immigration Minister, that said their ties to Australia should be a primary consideration. Mike, you were there as the Secretary of Home Affairs while this was in place. What did you think about it? Did you worry this was not a good idea when it was raised?
David, hopefully not going to be too surprised to hear. I'm not going to be breaching confidences where I've given advice or I've been party to discussions, because I think that just corrodes the confidence that ministers can have in their officials advising them. I'll make a more general point, because I was there. I've given estimates evidence on this, so it's no secret that we were tasked at the time to deal with the issue of perverse situations where 501 deportation, so Section 501 of the Migration Act, was resulting in people with long-standing ties to Australia, because they come here as toddlers or young children. Yep. They'd grown older. They'd done some jail time for whatever reason, and they were having to be removed. And so there was a need to address that issue. That's as far as I'm prepared to go. Safe to say, a very good friend of mine, known to both of us, of course, and to Sam, very dear friend of mine, Dennis Richardson, served for many years as a Deputy Secretary of Immigration. The best advice he ever gave me when I started as the Secretary of Immigration in 2014 was, Mike, just understand in immigration, whatever you try to fix over here, it's such a complicated act and a complex system, whatever you do over here is going to have a bunch of consequences over there. So you've got to be really careful.
Was that advice heeded on this one?
I'm not going to say that. I'm just applying the Richardson rule.
Right.
If you pull a thread over here, something perverse will happen over there. It's a really good... Dennis is always very wise on these things. The Richardson rule should always apply.
I hope he's going to listen to this, and we'll all remember the Richardson rule. Look, fair enough. Appreciate those confidences, and really appreciate the two of you joining us for this interesting conversation. Sam Roggeveen, Mike Pezzullo. Thanks so
David.
Much.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Sam.
Now, we're keen for your thoughts as well on this conversation, suggestions for the podcast. Please rate, review, subscribe wherever you're listening to this. And if you've got an idea, send us an email, insiders@abc.net.au. We'll be back in your feed next week. We'll also see you Sunday morning for Insiders. Bye for now.